supply chains. So the context is that companies in this landscape are facing an increasingly complex and potentially a complex landscape and are facing potentially competing demands in this landscape. So for us, the question we wanted to ask is, how do companies operating in Europe seek to navigate synergies and trade-offs between sustainability, competitiveness, and geopolitical considerations in managing critical mineral supply chains? So to answer this question, we had a set of sub-questions. So what are the incentives and priorities that drive companies when they're adopting their sustainable supply chain management strategies? What role do companies see for recycling and circularity in this space? How do legislative frameworks influence companies' practices? What trade-offs do companies perceive between the legislative demands and other objectives that they have? And what are the main constraints companies perceive to improve sustainable supply chain management? And finally, what tensions do they perceive and try to manage in relation to geopolitical risks and other ends such as competitiveness and sustainability? So we targeted companies that are downstream in critical mineral supply chains, essential to the energy transition. So utility actors, wind and solar power providers, battery developers, EV developers, and also in the defense sector, because they are also sourcing these materials. We did 11 interviews last year, 7 with companies in these sectors, 2 industry associations, and then 1 NGO working in one of our targeted sectors, and also a government council coordinating a multi-stakeholder agreement, especially with companies, on how to improve their human rights and environmental standards in these areas. And those last 2 were suggested to us by the companies we interviewed. There's some limitations in the data. We have the study that you're about to hear about. It's responses from largely corporate actors, and it's that corporate perspective, so it doesn't give you the full picture of how supply chains work and how sustainable they are. It's this one perspective because of the research question. We have a small sample, and it's self-reporting, and we think that there's selection bias here because it was hard to get companies to actually want to do interviews with us, and so we think it's maybe more top performers in this space that participated. But because we have top performers, or any kind of challenges that we identify are also likely to be present in other actors in the space. So what did we find? So for the incentives and priorities, we see a really strong emphasis on the business case for engaging in sustainability management in supply chains. So you want to mitigate any risks to your supply, you want to improve resource efficiency, and you want to meet customer demands and protect the reputation of the company. Here's a quote from one of the respondents: in the battery field, you are part of the energy transition. You can't sell on one end a product for the energy transition and pollute endlessly on the other. So this is also kind of a reputation and a business case and meeting customer demand, but it's also some legitimacy kind of reasoning going on here as well. Really strong market differentiation narrative among our respondents. So they want to distinguish themselves from competitors. They are providing green solutions, green batteries, green EVs, green wind parks, and so forth. They want to be seen to be going beyond simple compliance and that they're anticipating future standards. We find that the focus traditionally for these actors has been on human rights, conflict minerals, forced labor, increasingly more focus on environmental issues, but really a very strong focus on CO2 emissions. And for other environmental issues like water impacts or pollution, when those are linked to social impacts, for example, on livelihoods or health, those are the things that tend to be in focus. So we did see a bit of a carbon tunnel vision in the types of responses of what the focus was, because of both demands from their customers to really focus on the embedded carbon in their products, and also because there's good data available on that, and for other areas it's much harder. Another clear trend is that companies tend to select a set of hotspot or focused minerals that they really do a deep dive on. So they're not really able to, or not potentially willing to cover the full spectrum of critical minerals that they may be exposed to in their value chain. And rather looking at how important is the supply risk for them, how big are the sustainability impacts, and what is the volumes, and let that help them to decide what to focus on. How have these practices been changing over time? Well, we see that they're saying that they're moving from a more reactive to a more systematic approach. So previously, maybe more reacting to controversies, things that are happening in the media or by civil society associations, raising the alarm about issues, to being a little bit more proactive and trying to have a structured approach and methodologies for their practices. Also trying to move beyond immediate suppliers and to work deeper into value chains. Many actors lifted the importance of multi-stakeholder initiatives and certification. So these are seen as key tools for improving coordination among companies of what they expect in the supply chains, and increasing their ability to leverage, have some leverage on suppliers and their behavior. This focus on multi-stakeholder initiatives may be not too surprising, given other research that finds that legislators are outsourcing many regulatory burdens and relying on certification schemes in these areas. So you have like hybrid public and private arrangements. But we do see in general that the governance landscape here is characterized by a mix of voluntary international guidelines and regulatory measures. So often regulatory measures are based on what were previously voluntary guidelines. If we go over to recycling, our respondents definitely saw this as really of strategic importance for security of supply and reduce sustainability risks. They saw this as being really driven as well by legislation. So the EU battery regulation is mandating certain amounts of recycled material in batteries in the EU at different timeframes. But there's a lot of challenges in this space. There's limited availability currently of recycled materials and insufficient recycling capacity in the EU. And some of our respondents commented that currently battery waste is more valuable exported into those regions that do have this capacity. And so you're not actually keeping the materials domestically to be able to have this domestic capacity. So EU recycling capacity is only 1/10 of what is needed to meet 2031 targets, according to a recent report. And half of the projects announced to build up this capacity appear to be at risk due to technical issues or financial challenges. Finally, our respondents do see clear trade-offs here with competitiveness, because there are potentially high costs associated with using more recycled material and insufficient production levels, which makes it difficult to scale as a solution for them. We also asked them about legislation, and this is all the different types of legislation that was addressed in our interviews. I won't go through all of them, but you see some important ones here, like the Critical Raw Materials Act, the EU Battery Regulation, and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And we received some mixed messages on legislation. So positive impacts were mentioned by many actors. So they do think that legislation is pushing them to strengthen their practices. It is helping to harmonize standards and create a level playing field between actors. Especially these actors that we talked to, they said it's helping, it's kind of forcing the bad guys to improve. It's also making their sustainability requirements more credible with suppliers. So they make the comment that suppliers are starting to believe them really, and that they expect these standards to be met, especially if the legislation is putting some kind of financial penalties on them for not satisfying, or potential penalties on them for not satisfying these requirements. Another interesting result is that they see overlapping legislation as significant for the quality of their practices. So one quote is that from a respondents, they said that legislation like Germany's supply chain law, which focuses on first-tier suppliers, isn't enough. Other legislation like the deforestation, forced labor, and conflict minerals regulation requires to look further up the value chain. For full compliance, we need a broader approach. Another respondent reflecting on the CSDDD said that for many of these requirements, we are already baked into the battery regulation. They also apply to green financing frameworks. We would have done this kind of risk management regardless, given the reputational stakes for us. But there are also some more negative perspectives. So one respondent said one of the challenges is just the sheer volume of legislation coming in, and it is often difficult to interpret exactly what is required of us. I think that's reflecting a narrative that you're hearing a lot in the EU now, of course, with the omnibus proposal having recently come out to reduce legislative burden in the EU. Another respondent said legislation drives change, but the question is whether it will lead to meaningful implementation or just become a paper tiger with lots of reporting but no substance. So a concern that yes, this is driving them to do a lot of work, but are they doing the right kind of work? Are they just filling the forms and not really making meaningful changes on the ground in their supply chains? So uncertainty on requirements and impacts suggests that there's a risk of slow implementation and potentially doing the minimum to achieve compliance here. And there's also some conflicts here that come up in our interviews with competitiveness. So this legislation can increase costs and make Europe less attractive for investment, was one kind of concern, but also it can affect partnerships with suppliers. So suppliers may prefer to work with companies in regions that don't have such stringent sustainability requirements. Some constraints to improving sustainable supply chain management. Companies' material access, it's a clear priority. And so that's a bit in tension with sustainability and managing geopolitical risks. But they don't really want to talk about or frame it in that way. This is kind of an extreme example of a quote, but lots of quotes in this vein. So the respondent says a bigger importance may be access to materials. ESG credentials are not less important, but of course you might be forced to or need to compromise on that. So for the sake of access. They also price pressure. So low price production and refinement creates a pressure to source cheaply. And respondents say that sustainability is more important. They do see customer demand for that, but price is still a very important driving factor. And there was also a lot of uncertainty on some of the actors about the willingness to pay green premiums. So companies are maybe developing a green battery and they have this business model, but they're not sure if customers are actually going to be able to pay extra for a very sustainable battery. Low mineral prices, price volatility, and Chinese subsidies are also highlighted as undermining investment in alternative and even sustainable supply chains. And then weak transparency and traceability, that's a very common theme in the literature, and weak leverage over supply chains and another common theme. I thought I would take up this example of unintended consequences of goal policy. So one respondent said, it's difficult to prioritize one issue over another, but if we had to, human rights issues and sustainability risks would be at the top. However, with penalties for not selling electrical vehicles, our decision-making priorities may need to shift. So what this respondent is talking about is that car companies in the EU are fined if the average emissions for their fleet is over a certain threshold for each vehicle that they produce. There's a fine. And so they're saying that, well, given that fine, that economic incentive, we may have to be less concerned about sustainability to make sure we have the cheap materials to produce the EVs so that we can avoid that economic penalty. the omnibus actually rolled back that legislation with some interesting consequences. Yeah. Geopolitics, there's supply security concerns. So concerned about, in China, there was this export ban on graphite that raised a lot of concern. It didn't actually have the impacts that were maybe worried about at first, but it made actors in Europe aware that they really needed to have some more diversity in their supply chains and security in this space. I found that these actors were quite focused on competitiveness here when it comes to supply security, because they're companies, so maybe their focus isn't so much about energy security and those type of issues. Response to that is doing more vertical integration, maybe copying what China has done in its supply chains or trying to. So ownership of supply chain entities, long-term purchase agreements, buying critical minerals for other suppliers in different stages of the supply chain to ensure supply, and then actually investing directly in mines. Also, geopolitical de-risking was viewed as a strategy for differentiation as well. So if you can show that your supply chain is sourcing from places that has less risk, then maybe that's also something you can get a little bit more money for when you're selling to customers. We see some clear tensions between sustainability and geopolitical risks and competitiveness. So one respondent said the majority of Indonesian nickel is Chinese owned and to the extent owned by Chinese investors. I would say for all those angles combined, sustainability acts to geopolitics, it produces a very difficult conundrum for anyone looking for to source nickel sustainably. And so what this is kind of underneath what this person is saying is that there's a lot of cheap nickel in the market, and there's a market pressure on us to source from those actors. They may be less sustainable, and that may put us in the Chinese value chain in a very strong way, but it's difficult to get out of that situation because of the market pressures here. Also, a lot of concern about resource nationalism, which is less good for the EU, given that it has these dependencies. And also the expectation that the EU would, even if it does improve its domestic mining or increase its domestic mining, improve its refining capacity and recycling capacity, that these will not be sufficient for it. And then I'll finish off. So we just see a scenario where these actors have real difficulties balancing these different kind of pressures or drivers. Firms emphasize synergies, but they have some difficulties actually achieving those synergies given the market dynamics. We also see an EU policy approach that says that these things are reconcilable, but practitioners are showing that these things are actually in tension and difficult to reconcile. We've seen that the CSDDD has been rolled back in recent this month, or it's planned to be or proposed to be rolled back, and that, given the importance of legislation expressed in our interview, that can create an expectation that this will slow the progress in the space. And I think I'll end there because I'm over to. Thanks. Okay, so Daria, should you jump in here if you have any questions?
Hi, hello. I hope everybody can hear me online and offline.
Yeah, we can hear you okay. If you can speak up just a little bit, I think.
Okay, I'm gonna try and, is this better now? I think the mic was not.
Yeah, it's good.
Perfect, great. Wonderful. So thanks so much for the presentation. I'm wondering if we can maybe unshare the presentation for the time being, because then maybe I can see more people in the online room. Is that a possibility? Also,
yeah.
Everybody who is in the online room, if somebody feels like turning on the camera, certainly more interactive that way, but of course up to everybody else. So there are a couple of people. Hi, Eugene. There we go. So there are also a couple of people in the room as far as I can see. So I was asked to be a discussant on this, and I have 10 minutes, and I don't think I'll need all 10 of them, but just offering a couple of perspectives. So first of all, a really exciting paper I found, because like how often do we actually get to talk to companies about their perceptions of policies, not just as a standardized questionnaire or something, or not as a lobbying statement as they usually tend to give, but really in deeper insights into how they perceive this difficult dynamics. So I was very excited to read that, and thanks so much. There were also a broadness of issues covered, and so this was very, very interesting. And I think Aaron did a great job presenting all of those things. So I'll not comment that much on the context, but like really pick up from the policy perspective then. Sort of the things that went through my head when I was reading these different opinions and different views that were, as Aaron already pointed out, sometimes mixed. So sort of this mixed messaging on policies, and this really reflects the reality of these different impulses and imperatives that the EU as a policy unit, but also as a market is facing. So I think one interesting takeaway seems to be that legislation does make sense. So as you said, Aaron, that these were companies that were front runners. So at least there is a bit of a bias there, but at least for those front runners who really do try, legislation does make sense, and it seems to be an important push, an important factor in promoting more responsible sourcing of materials. And this is a very, something that is nice to read. However, there seems to be some sort of, we would love to have perfect legislation, but the legislation that we have isn't perfect. So while we think it makes sense, it could be much, much better in many aspects. And I think we all agree on that, because legislation is always imperfect in several aspects. So I wrote a couple of down. So it's too weak and too strong at the same time. So there is too much on one hand. On the other hand, there's not enough, because there are certain compliance issues. And depending on where you stand, I suppose. And it is always nested within this multi-level incentive structure. So it really depends on what other countries do, what are the international rules, how they change, and all of a sudden it makes more or less sense, whatever the EU is doing. And it is not perfectly sequenced. So for recycling, we really see we would need more legislation and more funding for recycling to make sense, even though we all agree that recycling in some bright future is a very important factor. And it is also interacting with other legislation, as the paper perfectly shows, that, sometimes shifts incentives and sometimes shifts the focus from, let's say, human rights to CO2 or whatever you're sort of looking at. I think this last example of automobile industry that needs to kind of choose between two different incentives is a perfect one. And this all, of course, creates uncertainty, and interestingly, as you say in the paper, sometimes even penalizes the front runners. So, if something is legislated and then sort of taken back, then you, as a front runner, you might be quite disappointed that you've invested that much, to say the least. And it also is imperfect in the sense that, of course, it affects different branches differently, and it really depends on what minerals, where you stand, are you small, are you big, and so on and so forth. So it cannot be perfect for anyone. So which begs the question, what is the best way of dealing with the fact that any legislation option is going to be imperfect? And how do we sort of create a process that makes it better and, starts us with the best possible option? And there, I just thought I'd offer some ideas, some thoughts on where to go from here, possibly. So if we all agree that there is a future where synergies between these different imperatives might materialize, and we see that, under certain circumstances, with certain technologies, with certain market structure, we can actually, in the EU, use more synergies than trade-offs between these, competitiveness, geopolitical incentives, and sustainability. What's the third one? So if there is this kind of state, how do we proceed towards it? And maybe like one sort of a general idea is, of course, not to legislate the final bright future state, but to legislate more the process towards that, and sort of apply a ladder approach. I have to say I copied someone from the Mistra Geopolitics final conference. I really like this idea. I think it was a panel on digitalization where somebody said, okay, it makes no sense to legislate the final state of that nobody can achieve. We really need to take it step by step and make sure that the companies that are moving in this direction actually not penalized because they are not good enough as compared to the final state. So this is one. Then, of course, I think also the paper talks about on some instances about the instrument mix. So it's a mixture of rules and standards and funding available, but also softer things like diplomatic approach, right? Like, so the external action instruments that actually help and provide this. And another aspect you mentioned was this role of certification and multi-stakeholder initiatives. So this all kind of comprehensive approach on different instruments is also, I think, an important point. Then legislation, I think, needs to be more flexible to react to rapidly changing incentives. So knowing that geopolitical situation and how big other markets might react or might legislate, and it may change the incentives for the EU, and also, you know, between the different boxes that you tick, it might make one box more important than others on short term. For instance, even staying in the market, and or maybe the geopolitical box, let's say. So the legislation should probably think about how to make a flexibility possible. So, you know, achieving sort of an index of these things instead of every one of these things, maybe an approach to follow. And finally, the recognition of trade-offs is the point that the paper also makes, and I felt it was a very important one. So instead of obscuring the trade-offs and thus sort of postponing them to the companies that then put them on the civil society, it would be much more politically difficult, but probably much more effective to recognize the trade-offs and the conflicting goals, and then legislate for that. So instead of saying we're legislating for this state where the synergy is already materialized, we are legislating for the process, very well knowing that there will be conflicting goals, and these conflicting goals will change in importance while we are transferring over the next 10 or 15 years to the synergetic state that we're imagining. So, which is definitely not easy. And the final remark, I think, would be interesting if also the group has things to contribute on the question of how companies can actually contribute to such a process. So, of course, the EU, if these are all the different ways that legislation should be better, how can companies participate in the process of making this possible? This is something, to be honest, that I think about a lot, also working on industry transitions, because in some ways, some companies often focus on the negatives and obstruct legislation to the point where they can no longer do it, and then they have to comply, but they're not maybe have not contributed in a productive way to creating a more doable legislative framework for them. And I was just wondering also in terms of the process, if you maybe have good examples or have some takeaways on the way how companies, especially the front runners, can actually improve the legislation on these different points. So that's that for me. Hopefully that can help the discussion start. And thanks so much for the great paper.
Thanks. Those are amazing comments, and you've taken a lot of space there. I'm just wondering if the co-authors here, maybe Nella, do you want to be first to jump in? Do you have any reactions, or do you?
Yes, thank you so much, Daria. I was thinking also on a reflection that we discussed, Aaron, about this issue of diplomacy as well, in a sense of, is it naive to think that there is a possibility, even remote, of having something that is agreed by everyone that it's involved, like a global agreement on these critical minerals, because I think that one of the main sort of negative reactions to this is the fact that it will affect negatively competitiveness, and that in that sense it will make it wrong to those who are more advanced. So I was wondering if that is completely out of the question, or is something that it's worth discussing it to a certain extent. And I think in terms of what you, Daria, mentioned at the end of how can industries can be more involved, I think that there is an interesting avenue through these multi-stakeholder initiatives that are trying to sort of gain power by numbers, because one of the things that some of these companies mention, and of course I acknowledge that it's a small sample, but it's that even the biggest companies that we interviewed, they mentioned how in comparison to the giants of mining, you know, they purchase just a little bit that is very important for an electric vehicle, but it's a very, very small piece. So then they don't really have like a bargaining power with these giants of the mining industry in terms of, you know, asking for more transparency and so on. But if all the actors within the industry get together, then they can sort of increase that bargaining power. It might still be limited, but it's something that maybe more of these initiatives are needed in a wider space within the EU, so they can have better power in terms of particularly transparency, I think. And I wonder what do people think about that. Those are my 2 cents, Aaron. Thank you.
Great. Do you want to jump in, Rasmus, or?
It's okay.
No.
Yeah, good. Well done.
Yeah, is there anyone else would like to jump in with a question or a comment? Why, Cecilia?
Hi, thank you so much. I just want to come off the back of Nella's comments just now. So my name is Cecilia. I represent the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, which is, I guess, one of these multi-stakeholder initiatives. On a broader reflection, the comments you received are spot on, right? I mean, automakers in comparison of automakers are very much focused on transition minerals. At IRMA, we've seen that. So 40% of lithium right now globally has been assessed against the IRMA standard. The largest graphite mine outside China has been assessed against the IRMA standard. There are 3 sites currently undergoing assessment in Indonesia right now, so that's nickel. But we still see lack of momentum for responsible sourcing on base metals, right? The copper, the bauxite, the iron, the volumes of that really come from the construction and from renewable energy. And these are 2 sectors that really struggle with traceability. And I think that's maybe one of the missing pieces, or we can discuss more later in the seminar, but traceability is really a key component of this discussion to really support companies in sending better market signals to contrast the power, let's say, or that, you know, what a mining company in the end is willing or not willing to do. Because a lot of the time, mining companies will say, where actually, I don't sell to you, Vattenfall or whichever other company. How can you prove that? And that's where, you know, the cooperation between the supply chain is needed. That's where laws that go beyond tier 1 are needed. And that's definitely something that we see in our own work today.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to have a quick reaction to some of the things that Daria said. Well, we're waiting if anyone else has a question, but I thought it was interesting that there was a couple of points that were interesting. One was this, that policymakers or the sector should be thinking in terms of those maybe specific value chains where they can really see they have an opportunity to make a difference. So being a little bit more strategic about that. That's also something that researchers can contribute to, and I think is very relevant for the Mistra mineral governance program. So I think it's a really good comment. And also, I was thinking also this idea that how do we have a process that matches what companies are doing? And so we did see that companies had certain systematic processes in place for prioritizing certain materials. And can you have legislation that kind of matches that and takes that process and tries to deepen it a bit and get it to go a little bit further, so that you're, as you were saying, working with companies. So I thought those were two things that were, yeah, really interesting to reflect on. Any other questions? We have time for questions and comments later on as well, so you don't have to feel too much pressure right now. If not, we can go over to the next talk, and I guess there will be some technical issues while I make the presentation.
I can probably share from my computer as well, unless you can do it there.
Still haven't received the.
Okay, then I can just share. Should I try and link?
Oh, maybe I'll just do it.
You.
Yeah, no, it's just this. So you should be able to. Yep. Just, you can also use the quick.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, so I think that this particular presentation should be really complimentary to Aaron's, because I don't focus on the corporate perspective at all. So in that sense, complimentary very much. And also in terms of geographic focus, the paper that I did with André also looks at Russia and China. And so I think that the non-Western perspective, I think, is also complementary to what's already been discussed. The states possibly would have been less relevant to the conversation 10, 15 years ago, but I think they're very much front and center today in terms of formulating the policy frameworks and the legislation that impact what corporations are doing. Obviously, depending on the case, there's different political economies, there are different tools that states have to regulate and to control what corporations do. There are also state-owned enterprises that very much engage in direct strategy making on behalf of governments. So it's a complicated mix, but I think it's very clear that you can't avoid sort of state perspectives and geopolitics that are underlying this wider rush for minerals across the world. And so the framing of this paper is sort of seeing the mineral conversation as part and parcel of great power competition. This includes, but is not limited to, of course, our Western dependencies on China, but also relate to what's been going on over the past 10 years in terms of decoupling with Russia and Russian supply chains. And Russia is also not a non-negligible actor, is not a negligible actor in many of these mineral supply chains. So what Aaron was mentioning in terms of geopolitical de-risking is really really front and center to that. So this paper has already been published, so I mean, I don't want to get way too into the specifics. Essentially, it does case studies of Russia, China, the EU, and the US, and essentially looks at state strategies and official documents. That says much less about implementation, obviously, and so these are broad policy frameworks not at the level of individual mineral supply chains, but sort of they create the broader framework for within which corporations increasingly have to operate. Sort of, again, there's variation, high variation across the cases in terms of their vulnerabilities, in terms of their capacities, in terms of their policy levers, financial, regulatory, power-based, and how those are influencing also not only their domestic markets, but international ones, as well as international partners or adversaries. But the problem with looking at state strategies is being based on political will. Those things are subject to change. However, I think there's still a lot of overlap, given that these were formulated sort of with very long time frames in mind. And although there are updates, I think the broad brushstrokes still apply. So just to get straight into some of the main findings, there are, I mean, one of the ideas behind looking at these different case studies is we have this narrative around the sort of this great power competition, this minerals rush, and this implicit and often explicit idea that it's a kind of a zero-sum game. Limited, ideas about limited supply, realities also of limited supply, sort of my loss is your benefit, and vice versa, dependencies as insecure rather than as sort of positive sum and integrative and efficiency enhancing. So we have development of duplicative, supply chains and the de-risking, which across different things. But it is a question: is it a zero-sum game or not? And therefore, that you kind of have to look at what are the games that each country is playing. And I think that it's kind of interesting to look at what they define as critical and or strategic, and where do they overlap and where they don't. Interestingly enough, when you look at the strategy documents that are based on the ones that are still relevant today, the current ones, at least in the Chinese case, we think it is still relevant, although there may have been updates that are classified. Actually, you see very diverse priorities, even in terms of the minerals involved. You've got different definitional subsets of minerals, and the sectors that they concern, although the US and the EU are very much focused on the boutique minerals, important for green transition and high tech. Actually, you have, in the case of Russia and China, still a heavy emphasis on mineral fuels, fossil fuels. More than that, different vulnerabilities in different sectors include agriculture, where fertilizer is important for the EU. It's important for China, and Russia is the high supplier. It's less so in the US case. The US, for example, deliberately excludes mineral fuels from their critical mineral lists, but that's not to say that fossil fuels are not coming back with a vengeance in terms of US governmental priorities. Interestingly enough, when you expand the scope of what we're talking about in Russian mineral and strategic mineral lists, as they've been updated in 2022, they included water and groundwater as strategic. And I would just like to mark a quote from one of the Russian, I think the current Russian minerals development strategy document, which is to single out groundwater as a strategic type of a strategic mineral, kind of in a separate category. But what they're saying about it is that in the long term, against the backdrop of the planet's population growth and deterioration of the environmental situation, the need for groundwater in Russia and the world will only increase. Things like that. And that also points to another kind of difference in the ways that minerals are conceived of. Critical minerals, as they're labeled and assessed in the US and the EU, it's really about supply vulnerability. But when you look at Russia and China, don't use the term critical, they use the term strategic. They include in their lists also minerals that they have high capacity in. So the tendency there would be to think strategic means more than just vulnerability. It also means leverage. It means ways in which a mineral can be used strategically. However, I do want to caveat that I mean, even the EU itself has a separate strategic raw materials list, which doesn't fully overlap with the critical minerals, critical raw materials list, because it's not about strategic only in terms of leverage. It's also about these are relevant for strategic industries. And we don't have a really clear sense of how Russia and China intend to use these minerals strategically, but it's also possible, and it is the case also certainly in China, where even if China has fewer supply concerns, these nevertheless are strategic minerals because they relate to strategic emerging industries and strategic sectors that are of policy attention to China. Interestingly, though, although there's a different mix of vulnerability and capacity in all these cases, in terms of the wider framework of sort of how they conceive of these things, without fail, all of the 4 cases are very much emphasizing that they want to mitigate vulnerabilities. Across all 4 cases, they're concerned with supply chain dependencies. So there's concerns there. I can get into any of these in specific. I don't want to take too much time maybe, but in terms of sort of the drivers of state intervention in this domain, there are many ones that go obviously beyond the 4 listed here, although the 4 listed here are things that we kind of delved into a little bit deeper. Importantly, that they're not all balanced in the same way but in all 4 cases, there's a growing emphasis and very heavy emphasis on essentially on domestic industrial policy, sort of the onshoring and the reshoring, with some friendshoring involved of these supply chains, which have been outsourced for too long, certainly in the US and EU case, but not only. Also in China and Russia, there's concern over of supply chain dependencies. Green transition, I think, was really the framing. It's kind of started the framing of this work in general. And it's still very important, a policy priority certainly for the EU, certainly for China. But we can see today that that's not necessarily the case as much now with the US, and certainly was not a very strong motivator for Russian concerns about strategic minerals. National defense and military supply chains is an important driver. However, it's important to note that in terms of quantity, it's very much less the case that supply chains are at risk. I mean, looking back, I think around 13 years ago, when sort of the debate about critical minerals was really heating up in the United States, the Department of Defense was barely concerned about this issue, and it's actually much more the political wing of the government that was asking the DoD to sort of take this seriously. And the DoD was like, well, we don't really see the problem. We have stockpiles. We have our supply chains. We're not really sure where these minerals are sourced from. But anyways, in terms of aggregate demand, I mean, military and defense supply chains are much less demanding than the wider industrialization and civilian sectors in all cases, even though that tends to occupy much more of the discourse and the narrative and the securitization of mineral supply chains. In terms of looking at, so I mean, one also important discussion point, which dovetails with what Aaron has said, is that a lot of these drivers, a lot of these policy goals, political goals really, they are working at cross purposes. So, I mean, it's not always the case that if you're focused on economic security and competitiveness, that aligns with green transition goals. If you're more concerned with national defense and military supply chains, that sometimes necessitates costs, which then, have mixed effects on industrial policies in terms of, also increasing prices at different parts of supply chains. So a lot of these don't work kind of in tandem. Actually, they're a very complicated mix of priorities, some of which fall to the wayside as others emerge. In terms of interaction effects and risks, in terms of looking beyond sort of the national policy frameworks, is that when you look at what this could mean globally, there are now a number of pretty good studies looking at the rush for critical minerals and the closure of supply chains rather than their integration across the globe as slowing down the pace of green transition. Us being so focused on economic security, national economic security, and decreasing dependencies is actually slowing possibly uptake of an advancement of clean technology. Geoeconomic escalation is certainly a concern, and you see that minerals are not only a sort of a battleground for not geopolitical and geoeconomic tensions, but they are also sort of the weapons that are being used in wider trade tensions, because they are points of leverage. And we've seen multiple cases of that already. And I wouldn't have said military confrontation would have been high in terms of the list of things that would be worth looking out for. And I still don't think so. However, I think recent developments in Ukraine, I think, have brought a really new dimension to this. And then in terms of spillovers to the developing world, I think that's where there are important negative spillover possibilities. But at the time, I think there was this also idea that we could possibly have a race to the top, where when you have the EU, the US, and China, for example, going to resource-rich developing countries, that this essentially gives developing countries more leverage and more negotiating room to, for example, say we want more value added here. And this kind of race to the top, I think it's a little bit now more in question because it's a possible race to the bottom, where you basically have resource mercantilism, where you have, I'm going to discuss it further in the next slide, but at least in relation to Ukraine. All of these things can be discussed more if necessary, and there's also, of course, the report that you can read if you have more questions. But in terms of Ukraine, I really just wanted to give some thoughts, because in terms of great power competition, there's really a need to update some of our, at least in terms of this report, needs to be updated a little bit, because some of the more kinetic, violent, and rapacious kind of activities of great powers, or the ones identified here. At the time when writing the report, it was more limited to what Russia was doing in Africa with the Wagner Group and Africa Corps, in terms of payments in kind, in terms of diamonds, gold, precious metals that were being traded, whether that was part of sanctions evasions or part of, just general sort of kind of rapaciousness on the part of non-state and state actors. But really, you see now that minerals are being subsumed into discussions of war and peace, and they have been really from the outset. It's not to say that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was caused by a desire for minerals, but it's certainly part of the war spoils. And these have been going on for the past couple of years. And what you have is essentially the incorporation of Ukrainian mining into Russian production networks. You have Russian mineral strategies very recently in last year that explicitly named Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson as really they're planned to be, and they already are being integrated into state industrial and developmental strategies. Russian state and strategies. You already have plans to export from occupied regions out as Russian exports of including, and this is not only minerals and fuel minerals, but also in the agricultural sector, metallurgical and chemical products from Russian occupied territories that are being incorporated into Russia completely. And at the same time, you have war spoils going on. You now have what the U.S. is essentially asking for in terms of reparations from Ukraine. There's still a lot of unclarity about what the Reconstruction Investment Fund actually is going to entail. But it's a really complicated discussion because it's no longer just about, although you have this overblown discussion about Ukrainian rare earths. Actually, the draft document of the minerals deal actually had a focus also on hydrocarbons. So this again brings back to the question of what minerals are we talking about, because fuel minerals are coming back with dimensions, which may also have implications for our discussions about not only green transition, but also the mix of minerals that are going to be relevant and why. Sort of, between violent Russian dispossession of Ukrainian minerals and reparations to the US, what is the role for the EU? There's a sense of, discussions about partnership, which used to be really the name of the game in terms of how these 4 cases were relating to the rest of the world. It was about mineral security partnership. It was about, the EU sort of minerals partnership agenda. But really, I guess at this point, it's really only, it's kind of up to the EU if they can actually implement something that is much more partnership based, that is much more respectful of the sovereignty of other countries, and how they're going to deal with that. I think is still a question. And in practice, sort of the very unclear logic of extracting from Ukraine in terms of economic feasibility and viability, how Ukrainian minerals would compete with domestic onshoring goals in the US and in Russia, because even with coal, I think there are some concerns that coal from the Donbass is actually competing with Russian coal producers, on the mainland. And green transition, again, as low priority for the US and Russia nowadays. So increasingly mineral security, however defined, is intersecting with war and peace dynamics, but in ways that we've got to still monitor. So these were just some, I think, thoughts besides the findings that I thought would be worthwhile for us to discuss if that's of interest. So I'll just stop there.
Great, thanks so much. And now we have, I'm not sure if Gunilla is there. She is. Oh, wow, it actually worked.
I'm here. Thanks. I'm sorry I missed the first part, but I was very happy to join for this presentation. So thank you for this. My name is Gunilla Reischl, and I work at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And I also work with several people here in the Mistra Mineral Governance program. So this report, I think I really enjoy reading this report, and I think it's very well researched and a rich report, and the analysis is very detailed. So if you haven't read it, I really recommend you to read it. I think it seems to fill a quite important gap in that using this sort of broad approach rather than focusing on particular countries or aspects of securitization and geopolitics. So both looking into drivers and implications in this survey on mineral security of the 4 major powers. I think that's really gives something to the literature, and hopefully you will be able perhaps to do some academic article out of it. I really appreciated this 2 chapters on national policy frameworks. I think that was like a very sort of interesting and a bit sort of novel contribution, and like the overview was a good learning experience for me to read that. I also like your discussions on criticality, which was also very good if you have different entry points. You don't know a lot about minerals. I think that's very useful. It could be very useful for many readers and stakeholders. So having said that, I have some comments that I have under three different headings. One is, I think, in the presentation you have been talking about things that are a bit related to my comments. But anyhow, so the first one is concerns like the more like a temporal dimension, perhaps, or the time aspect of this. So a question here would be that, I mean, if we have like, would it be a difference between how you view criticality and strategic prioritization in short and long-term perspectives? So would, like these great powers, would their strategic prioritization, would that shift depending on how long-term perspective you have? I think that comment will be a bit clearer later on, but because I was thinking like this analysis is written before Trump 2.0, and now we have a very different political landscape or political context. So it would be interesting to, if you have some reflections, or if the broader roundtable has some reflections on how we could do an analysis and what conclusions we could, what would it look like today? I was thinking in particularly on like aspects like friendshoring. How would that play out in this context, and how would block dynamics and bipolarity, is it something we could see today, or is it rather that we're moving towards more multipolarity? And how would mineral security play out in a multipolar world? I think, I mean, you indicate a bit of that discussion when you talk about, in the report, you talk about greater fragmentation and discuss other countries. So I was thinking, like, if we have like these resource-rich developing countries, how would they be in a world where you have power, where power is different or has shifted? So, I mean, so instead of having like two geopolitical blocks, that is something that you talked about. What could we imagine the world look like now, and how would that affect mineral security? Difficult questions, of course, but very interesting for a discussion, since it is a different landscape. Yeah, and also, I mean, would that kind of multipolarity, or like, would that mean more or less tensions than if it would have been two geopolitical blocks? So that was the question related to the time or temporal part. Then I also had a question, which is also a bit perhaps difficult, but when we talk about these policies and national policy frameworks, there's a lot of policies that are not implemented, and we have this sort of long-term perspective, like we talk about increasing mining in 10 or 15 years. But would it be different if, what would happen when these are implemented, if they get to implementation, these national policies or policy frameworks? I know some are already, but if there's a lot of policies that are in the waiting list, so to speak, to be changed or to be implemented later on, would that change how, like the political relations or interdependencies or between countries? So that was also one comment. And then I get into this the collaboration part, because I think, I mean, what forms of collaboration, I mean, this is a more general question, but what forms of international collaboration would be viable or feasible in this context, or in this sort of power shifted world, or the political landscape that we have today, in the context of mineral security? And I just got in when someone from the other panel discussed the global agreement. So I think that's an excellent and a very interesting discussion on to focus on, if it's possible. And then, I mean, in your report, you talk about that it could be I don't know if you actually suggested, but you talk about like this widening of existing multilateral agreements like World Trade Organization or UNFCCC to include like mineral security or and that, I mean, that would probably be quite problematic since it's a very politicized and securitized political issue. So, I mean, normally it tends to be very difficult to broaden or to sort of to include those kind of issues in multilateral agreements. It's bound to be a lot of resistance, and it's also, I mean, even if we think that it would be good to have some sort of international or global agreement, it might probably be a lot of problems in that as well. So that's also something that is interesting. I'm not for or against. It's just that it's something that you talked about. Then there's my last point here is on which is also related to international collaboration, and it's on the club approach that you talked about, and we have seen in the discussions more broadly on in mineral governance, and where we have like the discussion on if is it possible and with this the club or alliances that like what could their role be in this area, and when it comes to and this mineral security partnership or the EU raw material club, for instance, I think, I mean, that would also be very interesting in the political context that we see today that are evolving, and that relates back to what I said before on friendshoring and these geopolitical blocks. I mean, would it be possible to pursue these kind of clubs in this context? And there's also another aspect which is not really, I don't really know how it works in the context of mineral security or mineral governance, but if we look at climate clubs, for instance, they have been quite difficult. I mean, they're not always like one of the major sort of things against them is that it's quite difficult not politically feasible. There's a lot of legitimacy concerns from countries that are not part of this, in particular when it comes to, like, if we talk about CBAM, for instance, and the EU with trade protectionism and so on. So there's also, so that would probably complicate this part. And I was also a bit curious what the role for these more resource-rich countries would be in such club setting. Would they be able to participate there somehow, or are there any ideas on that? I don't know so much about this, as I'm very curious about it. So those were my questions. So thanks again for a very interesting presentation and read.
You.
Great. Do you want to react to a few of those, and the audience can think of some questions while you're reacting as well, if you want to?
Yeah, I think a lot of the questions centered on sort of the developing world or resource-rich countries, which were not really the focus of this this particular paper. So I think I can only kind of tangentially have some thoughts about it, but they may not be very well backed. But I think in terms of the temporal dimension, although it's absolutely true that we already see political will on certain agenda items, which we thought were sort of set, changing drastically and immediately, for example, on green transition and clean energy technologies, as sort of a driver of the critical minerals conversation, kind of sort of just like overnight off the US policy table. I mean, the reality is also this concerns about supply chain dependence on China, including in the mineral sector, were really precipitated by Trump and Trump 1.0. So I think in that sense, there is a certain continuity in terms of US goals. And, you know, Biden really upheld a lot of the Trump 1.0 policies related to economic security. And that's including in the mineral sector. So I think some of Trump's executive orders related to the minerals were upheld under the Biden administration. And these were very much in line. So I think there's continuity as much as there is discontinuity. But again, there is, this is going to play out. Certainly in ways that make a difference for how we're talking about this. Again, I mean, the new energy Secretary of Energy under Trump now has just gone on saying that he wants more fossil fuel uptake by the entire world. So in a sense, although, I mean, maybe the US is not looking for competitors in terms of fossil fuel, you know, markets, they want continued uptake of fossil fuels generally. They want those markets to be maintained globally. And that very much is in line with Russian long-term policy goals, which had, for again, a long time, with some, you know, language otherwise, had seen clean energy uptake globally as a threat to Russian economic security. So in this sense, there are definitely new dynamics that we have to take into account. I think there are really good questions about multipolarity, which in a sense, these are really, really difficult to answer questions because they're questions that are not only relevant to the mineral sector. These are being asked in every setting, on every issue related to everything politics and geopolitics. You know, minerals is just one tiny dimension of that. But I mean, I think there's a broad question of what multipolarity means for any realm of governance, any global and domestic challenge even, really. So I don't have answers, but in terms of just thoughts, in terms of how sort of resource-rich developing countries might engage. Yeah, I might just reiterate that while prior, you know, a couple of months ago, I would have said there's a potential for a race to the top, because at least you had at least 3 actors, the US and the EU and China, which were trying to make better and better offers to the developing world. You know, you sort of had the race to provide infrastructure, the global gateway, you know, the Build Back Better or whatever turned into global partnership, the US infrastructural sort of initiatives to the developing world, of course, China's BRI, all of which then, I mean, kind of were overlapping with some of the interest in minerals that all 3 had, the partnerships that they were building with developing countries, whether that was the Mineral Security Partnership or the EU Club or China's sort of different formats for discussions with the developing world. All of those were about bringing better offers to the table. And the competition aspect between the powers would have possibly given, again, and I think really was giving countries more negotiating power. If you look at the DRC and what they renegotiated with China, I think that was also in the context of great power competition, of China knowing that, well, the cards are not only in China's hands anymore, really. And I think the DRC was exemplified, I think, kinds of reevaluations that many resource-rich developing countries have been having and have been implementing all across, you know, Southeast Asia, Latin America, African countries, etc. But I think now, if I were to think about it, I'm seeing the sort of the pillars of the norms of sort of sustainability, corporate responsibility, CSR, ESG. These are no longer priorities. So it's a question, who's upholding them? You know, it would be very, I mean, certainly the EU is expressly still maintaining consistent interest on the policy side that this is a priority for them, but can the EU, and how, I don't know how much political will there actually is in the EU, how much will there is on the corporate side of EU industries. And I don't know that they can do it alone. You know, if the EU can alone uphold these standards of sustainability and sort of do no harm. It would be very ironic if China turned out to be a partner to the EU in this regard, or at least sort of constructive, which they have been, slowly trying to be, understanding that the global discourse has changed, and China has to kind of respond to the backlash against and how they had been doing business in the extractive sector before. But okay, and then maybe I'll just close there. And that really brings to the fore the question of multilateral institutions, because who's upholding them then? If you don't have them, if you don't have the EUS and the US and the EU and sort of the OECD countries upholding many of these things, who are the pillars of making sure what already are like hollowed out, because the power dynamics and the fragmentation are already influencing the effectiveness of the multilateral institutions, but on the normative side again. And it's actually a question for me whether or not emerging powers and emerging economies and developing countries are actually going to be interested and able to step up to actually say, we are interested in the sustainability agenda. We are interested in sort of climate agenda. We are interested in green transition. And I think I've seen some signals of that, but I don't have a very good sense, which maybe SEI would be much better positioned to have like a take on that.
We'll be the pillar.
Yeah, exactly. But also to sort of like keep a finger on how that conversation is playing out. And then finally, in terms of the multipolarity, although we focused on these 4 cases, I think that's really missing a lot of the picture of who's actually being important, who's important these days, because it's not only Russia, China, and the sort of bipolarity of West versus adversaries, which now is also falling apart because it's not clear, if the U.S. and Russia are cozying together in some respect, but also what about the Gulf states? What about Brazil? What about South Africa? What about some of the other countries that are sort of middle powers, Turkey, that are engaged and interested in getting involved and developing their own sort of contracts and supply chains? They're very much part of the mix. And whether this will be good for governance or I don't know. I have a feeling that it's not going to be about governance in a traditional sense of multilateral governance anymore. It's going to be transactional. But is the transactional world incompatible with sustainability? I don't know. I am quite pessimistic at this point. So I would say I'm a lot more concerned about it than I would have been 5 months ago.
Should we see if there's any questions in the room or from the online audience at this stage? Jump in.
I can jump in. I don't think people see me, but maybe you hear me.
Camera should be automatically amazing.
Okay. Rasmus from SEI. I just think it's interesting listening to both of your talks. Really enjoyed it, by the way, very helpful. I was trying to pick up the paper, but it sounds because in our paper, Aaron and Nella, I think one of the things we are sort of writing to is that sort of narrative about the reconcilability that we argue is in the policy discourse. But you're saying that it is clearly inherently intention and cross purposes. It's interesting. So it makes me think about perhaps there are multiple layers of discourse in these policy conversations. The pretense of we can make it work, we can make it sustainable, but then I'm curious about where you pick up the expressions about policy incoherence, how explicit it is, how much of that is in. I haven't read your paper. How much is in your analysis, and how much is it clearly expressed as well? But yeah, I just see some interesting interactions there between the two studies.
You want to jump in?
Yeah, no, because that was also something that I reacted to, like combining both of the presentations. It was because in your paper, you were talking about how there is this, they want to do the sustainability, or they want to be clear about their supply chains. But of course, like the economic pressure is always there, right? And then the same thing with the great powers now as well. And I'm thinking with Ukraine, right? If there is still this interest in the fossil fuels and in the hydrocarbons, right? Then the climate and the green transition are going to be left behind, again. So is this then, and there's in this backdrop as well of like this whole discussion on like rearmament and remilitarization and everything. Are we then, is that like, very pessimistic as well, that we are, there's not a space for climate or for the green transition or for sustainability to take like a priority role anymore. And we're back like 20, 15 years.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Era. I work for the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Really nice to be here, and thank you for both presentations. They were both really, really fascinating, and there are some strong, I think, synergies with several parts of the ITI's work. I was really interested to hear your remarks now on sort of the changing bargaining power or the strength and bargaining power of resource-rich countries in recent years. Also, because the ITI was closely involved in this renegotiation of the Sycamine contract that I think you were referencing there. And I was interested also in terms of talking about whether or not there's any compatibility between transactionalism and sustainability. I was interested to hear your thoughts or everyone's thoughts on sort of where these recent developments in the increased like militarization and securitization of these interactions around resources, where that leaves the bargaining power of resource-rich countries. And also another reflection on that, I think there's also worth considering whether the increased bargaining power, I think there might be some synergy between the increased bargaining power of resource-rich countries and sustainability issues, just because of the sort of the local impacts that unsustainable extraction has and the potentially increased dissent that might come from within resource-rich countries. So I'm just thinking, also to your point that you made, that whether or not resource-rich countries might start to be the ones to advocate for more sustainable extraction. I just think that's interesting to reflect on, also the local impact and the local dissent that could come from that and what role that might play. Thank you.
And maybe then we can just open it up completely to both.
Yeah. I mean, unless you want to react to anything, okay, or
Yeah, maybe I don't know if I understood your question, but are you saying, sir? I mean, we didn't do any sort of primary analysis on the irreconcilability dimension. But for example, the IMF sort of had this global fragmentation chapter about critical minerals and also food supply chains, looking at, if you have a bipolar world, if you have, fragmentation of markets along geopolitical lines, what that does. And it was kind of, I think, quite intuitive that it actually would be slower for the pace of green transition. And I mean, again, the fragmentation is based on agenda items around economic security, which is, mineral security is part of that economic security conversation. But then if the mineral security is about green transition, then I mean, these things are inherently sort of not, they don't have to be, but they are functionally working at cross purposes. And I think that and people have been looking at this for solar supply chains, solar panel supply chains, and found that had solar supply chains been decoupled from the outset, I mean, you wouldn't have had the uptake. You wouldn't have had the low prices that allowed for rapid adoption of renewables at the same pace. And fragmentation affects not only sort of production and manufacturing, it affects science and scientific exchange, and sort of the base R&D stuff that is also important, that had been sort of a global collaborative field for a while now, which that is also becoming highly sensitive. And I think where I think at least in terms of a analytical point that is stressed in the report is mineral security doesn't have a definition. Just like national security and economic security and climate security and all these different things. I mean, these are basically empty categories that politicians of the day fill with whatever they think is most pressing for their particular priorities and constituencies, et cetera, at the moment. So it's really hard to get a real firm pin, because if we could quantitatively say, well, this is bad for green transition, would that affect the policy? You know, and even at the level of policy, I mean, the EU and the US have had some discussions about the US's IRA, and whether or not the EU should have a similar response, and the EU kind of saying in one of these sort of research reports that we can't do this because this is going to just actually set us back in terms of green transition goals if we do the exact same kinds of things that the US is doing right now. So, I mean, these are very mixed up debates, which I don't think, even if we had all the data, I don't know that we would be able to resolve implicit tensions. No.
I want to open up, we only have 5 minutes left, and we've kind of answered the first 2 questions in this kind of general thing where we discussed them a lot. But I'd like to open up for the last question. But I'd just also like to just go on the point that you made, that there is also this point about there is an opportunity here to be working with developing countries to, you know, maybe support them in playing a bigger role in driving the sustainability agenda if they do have a position of leverage in these areas. So there's, I mean, we don't want to be pessimistic. There is an opportunity that should be, and I think is, but we could put more effort into that. And, you know, maybe countries bilaterally can do that as well. So we engage with our government to have them to work bilaterally on these issues. But I was thinking, like, just to open up generally, I know we're running a bit short on time, but the discussion has been so rich, we could go on. But is there anyone that wants to comment on, like, what they see as, you know, what are the important steps forward to try to resolve some of these tensions, or to, you know, improve governance or whatever it might be? Is there anyone wants to comment on that?
I would actually love to hear more also about the what you've seen on the side of the resource-rich sort of developing countries, and how they are kind of dealing with these tensions, and what they prioritize, and how they are able to leverage.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I guess there's a lot of diversity, of course, between different resource-rich countries in this regard. And the risk, I suppose, can also be the potential disconnect between national government and local communities, because it tends to be the local communities, of course, that really see the negative impacts of mineral extraction. But because in many of the key mineral producing countries, like Indonesia, for instance, there have been very severe local environmental impacts. And I think that is a continuous challenge, I guess, to create more. And I think it's something that the ITI is trying to work on in that regard, is to create more dialogue between local and national government, and involve local communities more in those kinds of discussions. Yeah.
Yeah, great. I think so. Thank you. Cecilia? Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. I just want to echo the colleague from the EITI. I'm sorry I didn't catch your name. Fully agree, right? How can we better ensure that participation from those that are most impacted by critical mineral projects in a way that truly reflects their concerns? At IRMA, I think, like, one thing that I'm really excited about in the next couple of years is that we've had, like, the first cycles of auditing, and companies right now, they're undergoing either surveillance audits or at the 3-year mark, another audit, right? So we're able to really see the progress and the benefits and quantifying those. What have they been for the communities? So, you know, the lesson learning, the transparency there, I think, will be fundamental to advance a lot of these things. And then to pick up on on what was discussed earlier around whether it is strategic partnerships or the MSP, what is like the value that can be added. I think an important role that governments must take is in remedy. So one of the biggest barriers, or one of the reasons why basically the mining industry has, such a difficult reputation, why people do not want mining projects on their lands, it's because oftentimes past harm hasn't been remedied, right? So it hasn't been addressed, those environmental concerns or those human rights concerns. So how can mining companies be supported by governments in remediating harm? That will be the basis for the trust building with the communities, with indigenous peoples, with workers, to then move forward together to, and build resilient supply chains at the end of the day.
Thanks. We have Andrea.
Yeah, I just have a question actually, and that is the views on having some type of compensation mechanism. So not just having like you have certification, but having that. I mean, it's the customer, so the company buying these materials. Are they would they be interested in paying more for them if they are extracted in a more sustainable way? And would it be possible to construct market mechanism for this to work? Or really, what's in it? Is someone prepared to pay for it? And do you think that would work?
I'm happy to answer, but I don't know if there are others in the room.
Go ahead, answer.
Yeah, it's a great question, André, one that we get a lot, right? Who's willing to pay the premium? Now, what we see as a trend is rather preferential contracts. So if you have like, the IRMA, if your mine site has been assessed against the IRMA standard, then you may have a preference against another supplier, right? So it's like, we don't so much see the premium being paid, but more the preference in contracting. And then, right, the long-term relationship that you get, for instance, with the automaker in that case. And then the way we think about it also, it's what's the cost of inaction, right? Or what's the cost of not doing business responsibly? And this is something that we're seeing the auto sector in particular pick up more and more and address with their suppliers. So in short, no premium, preferential contracts, but also what's the cost of not doing responsible business?
Great. And I think we have a question from, is it Eugene?
Yes, thank you very much. I thought it was super nice dynamic between two reports. Because since you asked, like, what else could be added to the maybe future prospects of this kind of research and role of governance, I'm thinking about systemic approach to circular strategies for critical raw materials. There is so much investigation regarding how to decrease the demand for critical raw materials through circular strategies, and whereas recycling is kind of at the end of the list of priorities when it comes to scientific approach to this. But I understand that from the corporate perspective, we mostly, we're not going to hear it because it's the kind of recycling is the only strategy that may be compatible with the current business models. But when it comes to governments, this report on China, Russia, United States, and European Union, it's kind of disturbing that none of the great powers introduced any circular strategies in their dealing with critical raw materials. And we can see the trend, for example, Norwegian mineral strategy in 2023 introduced more circularity when it's remining, for example, but also different kind of strategies like reusing and so on are moved forward. So I think for the future, like, that's what governments should do. They should introduce more strategies towards circularity of those to decrease actual demand, which can impact the resource security at the end.
Yeah, thanks. I just think that that links also to a question that came up before about the time frame, because you have to remember that for a lot of these, we are talking about a transition. And I think even like the geopolitics, like once these infrastructures are built out, then you do get like maybe quite different dynamics. And it's not like oil. These are different technologies, right? And so that's a really interesting question as well. And then in that world, then circularity, of course, should play a very important and strategic role. So yeah, maybe a final question is, was that Daria, did you want to say something or no? I just saw you lighting up. No, you weren't lighting up. No.
I did lit up for a second. I'm just adding to Eugene directly. I think like the whole framing of sufficiency is a security strategy. Not that I'm a fan of securitizing things, but I think we really need to like put the money towards that because it's a security strategy on a continent like Europe.
Yeah. And the companies were asking for that, of course. We have to end. We're over time, but I would just like to thank everyone, especially the discussants that took the time, and really outstanding points from both of you. So really appreciate that. And to the co-authors and all the participants and comments, it was really great. And to the presentations, of course. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Great discussion. Bye-bye.
Everyone. Thanks to you, Aaron, as well. For the nice thing. Yeah.
Yeah, actually very nice.
On a Friday.